Debt Free in 30, where every week we take 30 minutes and get practical advice from industry experts about personal finance and living debt-free. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
It is December 2017. We've just finished Financial Literacy Month, where many people talked about some of the personal finance books they've read to learn about money management. And now, as we head into the holiday season, I know what you are all thinking. What book should I give as gifts this year? And yes, of course, I think everyone should buy dozens of copies of my book and give them to everyone you know, but there are lots of other great books. So if I was starting a personal finance library, or if I wanted to give books to my adult children or my coworkers to help them better manage their money, where would I start? That's the question I'll answer on this edition of Debt Free in 30. Today I present a list of 10 personal finance books that you should read or give as gifts. Here's how I compiled the list. I picked books that I have read, so there may be lots of better books that I haven't read, but since I haven't read them, they aren't on my list. Next, all but one of the books on the list are by Canadian authors and are written for Canadians. There are lots of great American books, but I want to read about Canadian topics like RRSPs, not American concepts like 401ks. The one American book on this list is not strictly a money book, it's a thinking book, so the fact that it's not a Canadian book doesn't matter. I also picked books that are readily available. I checked, and they are all available at Amazon.ca, and most are easy to find in libraries and your local bookstore. Finally, I picked books from 4 different categories: general money management, real estate, retirement, and thinking. And yes, I will admit that I made up these categories, but these categories allow you to focus on books that meet your interests. That's why this is not really a top 10 list. There are lots of other books that perhaps you should read. I have 2 real estate themed books on this list. If you're really interested in real estate, there are lots of other good books on that subject, so your list of important books will be different. With that background, let's get started with the first 6 books on the list, all from the category of general money management. First, I would start with one of the best-selling Canadian personal finance books of all time, The Wealthy Barber Returns by David Chilton, which is a follow-up to his first book, The Wealthy Barber, which was also a bestseller. I've put The Wealthy Barber Returns and not the original book, The Wealthy Barber, on the list because the original one is much harder to find, and it's expensive if you can't find it. But as I record this, The Wealthy Barber Returns is selling for about $10, brand new, on Amazon, so it's a great value. I like this book because it's easy to read. The chapters are short, there is a minimum of technical jargon, and he uses a storytelling format, so it's like reading a story and not at all like reading a textbook. Book number 2. If you like the narrative format, a more recent book is Wealthing Like Rabbits by Robert Brown. Now, full disclosure, while I've only exchanged voicemail messages with David Chilton, I've actually met Robert Brown, and I like him, so that may cloud my judgment, but I don't think so because I read his book before I met him. The first time we met was back in 2014, when he was a guest here on Debt Free in 30. Here's what Robert Brown told me when I asked him to explain the title of the book, since I had never heard of the word wealthing, because, as I said to Mr. Brown, I don't think the word wealthing exists.
It exists now, and wealthing comes from an idea in the book where we take the word wealth, which you're right is traditionally a noun, but turn it into a verb. I think we use the word saving too much. We save in our RSP. We save when we go out for dinner. And I think that whenever we do any saving that contributes to our overall net wealth, we should call that wealthing. It's just a little bit more fun and a little bit more exciting. And if you wealth like a rabbit, then you become wealthy very quickly.
Because rabbits multiply very, very fast. And if you want to read the book, you've got some examples of how that actually works. So wealthing for you is more than just saving then.
Sure. Wealthing is, a lifetime experience where you make a commitment over the course of your life into putting a little bit more money away every week and building your net wealth.
And as I said off the top, I've read the book. I think it's a great book. The each chapter starts with a quote, and the first quotation in the book is from Homer Simpson, so I was on board immediately. I watch that show every week. In the book, you talk about a bunch of other things, zombies. You're quoting, I believe, both Captain Picard and Spock in different chapters in the book. The opening chapter, I think, is, a fantastic chapter. You contrast two different paths, and I'm going to let people read the book to read it because I can't describe it. It's a fantastic opening chapter where you tell the story of a person who followed this path or that path, and obviously one path is a lot better. Tell me what the main message then is that you're trying to get across in this book. What's the basic concept then? What's the key message here?
Let me touch on a couple of things. The book is entitled Wealthing Like Rabbits, but its subtitle is An Original Introduction to Personal Finance. And what I think makes my book a little unique is its style, the style in which it's written. I didn't use a lot of charts or graphs or analysis to teach about money management and personal finance. I did use a lot of humor and anecdotes and pop culture references. You mentioned Homer Simpson. You'll also find quotes in there from Sheldon Cooper and Shrek. And every chapter is a little different, a little eclectic, if you will, in the message that it teaches. You talked about the first chapter, which is a story about a lady named Lisa. She's 57 years of age, and in the first time we tell Lisa's story, she's having a bad morning. She's had a fight with her husband the night before about money, and as you walk through the chapter, the story of Lisa, you can see examples of small decisions she's made throughout her lifetime which have impacted her finances by the time she's 57, and she's got a bit of a tough road to haul. We tell the same story over again, and it's the same Lisa at 57 years of age, but she's made different small decisions throughout the course of her life, and those decisions have accumulated into a much brighter financial future. So it's not that Lisa, in the first example, has done something horrible. She's invested in a Texas oil stock that went south. She's just made small decisions better the second time around, which accumulated into a better lifestyle. And that's how we kick off the book.
And maybe that's a really good summary of the book, that life is a whole series of small decisions. And you're right, the difference between the really successful person and the not so successful person isn't that, well, I bought Apple stock 20 years ago and now I'm a multimillionaire. It's little tiny things over and over that either work or don't. So why don't you give us one example of a little tiny thing, and throughout the book there's hundreds of examples, but because we like to talk about practical advice here on the show. Sure. What is one practical thing that I could do or not do as a resident of this fine country of ours that would either set me up for a greater chance of financial success or do the opposite?
I'll refer you to the chapters on mortgages or housing. And there's actually 3 chapters in the book dedicated to specific things on housing, because your first home is arguably the most important purchase decision you'll make throughout your lifetime. And I'm a big proponent of small houses as opposed to great big monster houses. And I tell the first chapter is around mortgages, and I tell the story of mortgages by telling the story of 2 brothers who are plumbers. You may have heard of them, Mario and Luigi. And Mario and Luigi each go off to the bank to buy their first home with a $100,000 down payment. Brother number 1 buys a big, expensive home that he really can't afford, but he manages to talk the bank into giving him that mortgage. His brother Luigi buys a more modest home that costs $175,000 less. But as we go throughout the chapter, Mario actually ends up spending $400,000 more than his brother by the time he gets the mortgage paid off. And throughout that chapter, we teach how a mortgage works, the different terms that come with the mortgage, but we also show how a smaller down payment and default insurance and spreading it out over a longer period of time costs his brother so much more money.
So you can see why I'm such a big fan of Wealthing Like Rabbits. Robert tells a story, so it's easy to understand, but his philosophy is very closely aligned to my own thought process. In the example he just told about Mario and Luigi, he illustrates the perils of buying too big a house, a theme I also discuss in my book. Wealthing Like Rabbits has lots of great advice, so it's definitely on my reading list. When it comes to money management, there are only 2 ways to increase your bottom line, or have more money left over at the end of the month. You either have to increase your income or reduce your expenses. There are lots of books out there about how to find a better job, but on the how to save money side of the equation, there is one book that is easy to read and is packed with lots of practical tips, and that book is 397 Ways to Save Money by Carrie K. Taylor. Carrie, who has been a guest twice on this podcast, is the proprietor of the SquawkFox.com blog, which is packed with money-saving ideas, like her blog post from earlier this year titled, How to Save $2,940 a Year on Lunch. That's Carrie for you. She doesn't tell you how to save $3,000. It's the more precise $2,940 that she uses, and it's the same in her book. She didn't want to water down her advice by giving you 400 ways to save money if the last 3 weren't very good, so she stops at 397. She gives advice on things like saving money on homeowners insurance and gives more esoteric advice like brushing your dog's teeth to save on vet bills. I don't have a dog, so I'll have to take her word for it on that one. Most of her advice is easily implementable by anyone. You don't need any special skills to follow her advice to save money. Here's the best part. 397 Ways to Save Money is available now on Indigo.ca and Amazon.ca for less than $10. That's a great deal. Follow one of Carrie's 397 tips and you've got your money back. Next on the list is another well-known Canadian author, and that's Preet Banerjee with his book Stop Overthinking Your Money, The 5 Simple Rules of Financial Success. What makes this book so good, other than the fact that it's written by a Canadian for a Canadian? Well, as Gail Vaz Oxlade says in her endorsement on the cover, and I quote, 5 simple rules. That's all. Follow them. End quote. I won't tell you Preet's 5 rules. You'll have to get the book to read them. But I will tell you that rule number 3 deals with debt, and I agree with what he says, and his advice is similar to the advice I give in myth number 8 in my book. Again, this is an easy book to read. You don't need to know any technical jargon, and it's available online and in bookstores everywhere. I just read Gail Vaz Oxlade's endorsement from Preet Banerjee's book, and no list of Canadian personal finance books would be complete without a book written by Gail. Next to David Chilton, the next best-selling Canadian personal finance author is Gail Vaz Oxlade, who has also been a guest a few times on this show. I could fill up the entire top 10 list with her books, but if I had to pick just one, it would be Debt Free Forever because, well, you know, I like being debt-free, so that's my pick for number 5 on our list. It's a great book to give as a gift, particularly if you know someone who is struggling with debt. Those of you who have watched Gail's TV shows like Till Death Do Us Part will know that she advocates a tough love approach. Perhaps a better way to say it would be that she believes in discipline. She wants you to take charge of your life, and she knows it's not easy, but again, she's got lots of practical advice to help you become debt-free. Her latest book is Money Talks, When to Say Yes and How to Say No, which is a book that walks you through how to talk about money with family and friends. It's also a great book. Gail also co-wrote a book with Victoria Rice, published last year, called CEO of Everything, which is a great book if you find yourself suddenly single. Victoria was a guest twice on this show, so I'll put links in the show notes to those interviews. See my point? I could pick lots of Gail's books to include on this list, but since I've limited myself to one book per author, I picked Debt Free Forever. Of course, you're not limited to one book per author, so if you are a Gail fan, pick as many as you like. The final book in the general money management category is written by another Canadian author who, like Gail, is often seen on TV and who has also written many books, and that's Kelly Keane. Kelly has published many books, including books for everyone like A Canadian's Guide to Money Smart Living and The Money Book for Everyone Else, as well as special interest books like The Woman's Guide to Money and The Prosperity Factor for Canadian Kids. Those are all good books, but my favorite is a book she wrote that you can't buy on Amazon, and I don't think it's in bookstores. The book is Protecting You and Your Money, A Guide to Avoiding Identity Theft and Fraud, and it's a book she wrote for the Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada, and it's available on the CPA website. I'll put links in the show notes. I've got this book on my must-read list because it's the only book that deals specifically with identity theft and fraud, which are very serious problems for all Canadians, but particularly for seniors. When Kelly Keane was a guest back on podcast number 132, she told me that Canadians lost an estimated $2 billion to mass market fraud last year. And when she was a guest back on show number 75, I asked her for practical advice on protecting yourself from fraud and identity theft. And she gave me some of the tips from her book. Here's a small sample of her advice.
There's so many things that we can do. Number one, we really want to slow down. We want to be careful when we're clicking email. We want to be careful when we're, picking up the phone. Do we even need to pick up the phone? And these tips, we need to have conversations with our parents and our kids as well. Not that they're picking up a home phone. They don't
know
that.
what it is. No clue. Yeah.
But, I know my mom still does. And just really is this reasonable? Because remember the phone spoofing is really good. They can actually make it look like it's the Toronto police calling you. They can, so just slowing down. Is this logical? Would my bank ask me of this? Being more careful of what we're putting online, have a family conversation about it, realize how important our information is, stop giving it out. And then when it comes to, let's say, full-on identity theft, the easiest thing that you can do is check your credit report, okay? If someone is applying for a credit card, a loan, something of that in your name, it will show up on both of your credit bureaus. So in Canada, there's two main credit reporting agencies, Equifax and TransUnion, okay? Make sure if you go online, you go to the .cas. And if you would see there that somebody applied for this XYZ financial or something, you're like, that's not me. Now, that will tip you off that identity theft is happening. Now, it might be too late to really ward that off, but at least you can clean it up.
So would you be doing that once a year, more frequently?
If you're in a low risk situation, you don't really do a lot, you don't use your, I would say once a year is fine. What you can do is also get a credit monitoring service. You have to pay for that. But maybe if you're a high risk person like me that goes online all the time and all of this and
travels a lot.
Sure, has to do Facebook, has to do Twitter for their business, right? I put myself at risk. You might want identity theft insurance if you also feel that you're at risk. But what you can do with both credit reporting agencies is put a proactive fraud alert on your account, okay? This is not if you've been a victim. You're just saying, hey, I want to be proactive. It costs $5 for each credit reporting agency and it lasts 6 years. And what that does is it's an extra layer of protection where if somebody's trying to get a cell phone in your name or something like that, the lender has to give you a call. It says on the file, give a call. So you want to use your cell phone number because if it's you legitimately trying to get a bank loan, you don't want them calling home to authenticate that it's you. So that's a great extra layer of protection. Everyone should be checking their report at least once a year to see if things are accurate. Even if you don't require credit, at least to see if something's on there. And then very lastly is making sure you know what mail is coming in. Not very last, I'm going to have one more tip. Make sure you know what mail is coming in and when, especially for older people that vacation a lot, business people, they really need to be concerned about that because if bills are going missing, that could be a first red flag too, that mail is being diverted. And so you could say a lot of younger listeners will say, well, I've done everything digitally. I'm online with all my bills. That's great. My personal, finance hat comes on saying, make sure though you're checking those bills that you're not overcharged and all that type of stuff. Cause when we don't get it in the mail, sometimes we forget to comb through. And like you said, look for those little purchases, couple dollars here, couple dollars there that weren't you. Cause if you're not noticing that, the fraudsters will go for the big kill. And then very lastly, shred absolutely everything. Even if it, it came in, unless it says dear occupant, if it has your name on it, shred it.
That's just a very small sample of Kelly's advice on protecting yourself from identity theft. I'll put links to my 2 interviews with Kelly, but for a lot more practical tips, her book is called Protecting You and Your Money, A Guide to Avoiding Identity Theft and Fraud. And it's a book she wrote for the Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada, and it's available on the CPA website. And the best part is that it's available for less than $10, so it's a great deal. And I'll put links in the show notes if you want to purchase a copy or 2. So, the first 6 books on my reading list are general money management books, but the next 2 deal with a topic that everyone seems to be talking about, and that's real estate. The first one, book number 7 on the list, was released in 2015 and is called When the Bubble Bursts: Surviving the Canadian Real Estate Crash by Hilliard Macbeth. Mr. Macbeth is a portfolio manager, and he's advised clients for almost 40 years. He was a guest back on podcast number 89, and I started by asking him why he thinks Canadian real estate is in a bubble.
Well, in the research, I found that it's very unusual for house prices to increase at such a rapid rate over such a short period of time. So people have what's called the recency bias, where they view the last 5 or 10 years as the norm. And the problem with that is when you look back longer, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, which is easy to do, there's lots of data available, you find out this is a very unusual situation. The symptoms of a bubble are pretty straightforward. A period of rapidly rising prices. People tell each other stories as to why that makes sense. And people experience regret or fear of missing out. Regret that they didn't get in earlier, or fear of missing out. If they don't get in now, they'll never get in. And then the fourth symptom is the media start talking about the bubble. So we're contributing to that right now, I guess.
There you go. Well, I suspect the media is way ahead of us on talking about this. So you think we're in a bubble because real estate prices, and I guess we have to clarify a little bit. Certainly in places like Toronto and Vancouver, real estate prices are much higher today than they were a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Presumably there are places in the outskirts of the country that have not moved much. So is this a localized phenomenon, or is this everywhere in Canada?
It's a great question. And actually there's a bit of a myth that's developed. It actually started during the election campaign last year. It was by a politician who was running for re-election, that it was just Toronto and Vancouver, but the reality is different from that. The bubble is widespread throughout Canada, and prices have increased by 2.5 to 3 times. 3 times in Vancouver and Toronto, and 2.5 times. There's probably some places in Canada where the prices have only gone up 2 times, but everywhere there have been rapid increases in prices over the last 15 years. And the thing that I want to impress on people is how unusual that is. It's extremely unusual. And the reason that it's not sustainable is that houses are basically bought out of income. So people pay their monthly mortgage payments, their maintenance costs, their interest, their taxes, all that stuff that goes with being a homeowner. They pay it out of income. And incomes have maybe risen 15% over the last 15 years, 1% a year. Depending on whether you take after-tax or pre-tax, it doesn't really matter that much. Inflation has been similar. It's been under 2% for quite a long time. So for house prices to be tripling during that same period, the ratio of house price to income, which be income determining what people can afford to buy, is gotten so stretched that it's a bubble that cannot possibly be sustained. And unfortunately, for many, many Canadians, it's going to be very harsh and painful when the bubble bursts.
We recorded that interview back in the spring of 2016, so over a year ago, and I think Hilliard Macbeth's warning that when the real estate bubble bursts it will be harsh and painful is now becoming more obvious to more people. So if you want a big picture view of where the real estate market is at in Canada, when the bubble bursts is a great starting point. That's the big picture view, but what if you just want to know how to pay off your mortgage faster? The obvious book to buy to answer that question is Burn Your Mortgage by Sean Cooper, which is book number 8 on my list of 10 books for your personal finance library. Sean Cooper was a guest back on show number 81 after he became something of a media sensation when he lived frugally and paid off his mortgage in just over 3 years. He returned this year on show number 129 where he talked about his new book, and that show, as I record this one, is our most downloaded show of the year. Sean was very frugal and worked more than one job, and that's how he did it. He freely admits that if you were married with children and not single like he was, it would be much more difficult, but he still has good advice for everyone who has a mortgage. You can listen to my 2 podcasts with him for more details, but here's a quick snippet from Sean Cooper. I asked him whether or not you need to already own a house to benefit from his book. Here's his answer.
Well, my book, you don't have to own a house to benefit from it. You might be a first-time home buyer or be a renter who wants to get into the market. So basically, in order to purchase a house, you have to have all your finances in order. So if you have a lot of credit card debt, it doesn't make sense for you to go out and buy a house and take on a mortgage and more debt. So it's about getting your financial house in order. So for example, I've talked about at the beginning of the book, setting a goal, because for so many people, what keeps them from being homeowners is they're not able to come up with that down payment. So basically, by setting yourself a specific goal of how you're going to come up with your down payment, I find that effective. So basically say, I want to buy a house in, for example, 3 years time, and I'm going to save, for example, a $60,000 down payment, and then figure out exactly how much from each paycheck you need to save to reach that down payment. Because $60,000 on its own seems pretty like a massive amount of money, but kind of breaking it down into smaller amounts, it makes it seem less intimidating.
So really the first part of the book, you are laying the groundwork for basic financial principles anyone can use. So you don't have to be a homeowner. You don't even have to want to buy a home, I guess. These are principles that will work for anyone who wants to get their financial life in order.
Exactly. Everyone will benefit from reading the first part of the book.
So then the second part of the book, which I would summarize as being, home buying and mortgages. Obviously, this is a section much more geared towards people who want to buy a house or, and obviously you're going to need a mortgage to do it. So what are the kind of areas that get covered in part 2, the home buying and mortgages section?
Well, I kind of walk people through the whole situation of purchasing a house and things to look at. So, for example, some people have to make big decisions like living in an urban area or suburban. And then, of course, you have to decide on property types. So condo, townhouse, or detached house. So I kind of look at the pros and cons of that. And then I go through the list of needs and wants when you're a home buyer, because I find a lot of people nowadays are getting needs and wants mixed up. For example, things like granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, people seem to be putting that on the needs list rather than the wants list. So it's kind of taking a big picture approach to buying a house and seeing exactly, if you want those things, how much money it's going to cost you, but it's going to be a trade-off because it's going to take you that much longer to pay off your mortgage. So it's just kind of taking a big picture overview of your finances.
That's Sean Cooper talking about his book, Burn Your Mortgage. When it comes to personal finance, once you've dealt with the basic topics like budgeting, saving money, and money management, and then figured out what to do about real estate, the next logical topic is retirement. Again, there are lots of great retirement books, and many of them explain the mechanics of how much you need to save for retirement, but the retirement-themed book I've got on my list is Victory Lap Retirement by Jonathan Chevreau and Mike Drack, which has an interesting take on preparing for retirement. In fact, they actually present an alternative form of retirement, which is quite interesting. The traditional view of retirement is that you work for the same company until age 65, and then you retire and live off your company pension. Of course, that is not reality for most Canadians. Most of us don't have a pension, and many of us will either retire well before age 65 or keep working past age 65. The concept behind a victory lap is that retirement does not need to be a hard stop, where one day you're working and the next day you're playing golf. Many of us will take a victory lap by easing into our retirement, working part-time, or spending our time and perhaps earning some income by pursuing our hobbies or other interests. To actually take a victory lap, some advanced planning is required, and that's why I think Victory Lap Retirement is a great book for anyone contemplating retirement. The final book on my list is totally different from all of the other books. In fact, it's not a personal finance book at all, but it does help the reader understand how and why we make the decisions we make, financial and otherwise. The book is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Dr. Kahneman is a professor at Princeton University, and he is the only non-economist to have won the Nobel Prize in Economics, which he won in 2002 for his work on decision-making. This is an academic book, so it's not an easy read like The Wealthy Barber Returns or Wealthing Like Rabbits, but if you stick with it, it will challenge the way you think. He talks about how we humans make decisions, and while he did not invent the concept, He uses the notion of System 1 and System 2 decisions to show that while we think we make rational decisions, it is really our System 1 gut that is responsible for most of our decisions. I obviously agree with his points, and my book, Straight Talk on Your Money, reaches the same conclusion, that we humans make most of our decisions based on emotion, not rational thinking. So if you want a book that will make you think, Thinking Fast and Slow is a great read. I could keep listing books. There are many other great ones, including some by authors who I'd like to get on the show in 2018, but I like to keep Debt-Free in 30 to around 30 minutes, so I'll stop there. But what I will do is put a list of all of these books, and some that I haven't mentioned, in the show notes over at Hoyes.com. If you've got other ideas, feel free to tag me in a tweet at Doug Hoyes, and I'll share them out. So there you go. Your holiday shopping is done. Head to your local bookstore for these great books. And while you're there, pick up Straight Talk on Your Money. It's the newest of all the books I've mentioned, so there's a good chance your gift recipient hasn't read it yet, so that alone makes it a good choice. If I had to categorize Straight Talk on Your Money, it is a general money management book because I deal with 22 myths that get people into financial trouble, and I end every one of those 22 chapters with practical advice. But it's also similar to Daniel Kahneman's book in that I also spend time exploring how and why we make the decisions we do. Obviously, I don't have a PhD, and there is no chance I'll be winning a Nobel Prize anytime soon, but what I do have is my notes from the in-person consultations I've done with well over 10,000 Canadians in financial trouble over the last 2 decades, and I think that real-life experience gives my book a somewhat unique perspective. It's also easy to read, widely available in bookstores and online. There is a Kindle and Kobo ebook version, and there is also an audiobook version available on Audible and Apple iTunes. So if you like listening to me on this podcast, you can hear me read the entire book. So there you go. 10 books to help you start your own personal finance library or gift ideas for friends and family. And remember, the nice thing about paperback books is, if you're gentle, you can read them and then give them away as gifts. And just think, by spending $100 for 4 or 5 books, you may save yourself and your friends and family thousands of dollars in the future. So it's the gift that keeps on giving. That's our special personal finance book edition of Debt-Free in 30. Full show notes, including a transcript and a link to every book I've mentioned, can be found at Hoyes.com. That's HOYES.com. Thanks for listening. Happy holidays. Until next week, I'm Doug Hoyes. That was Debt-Free in 30.